It's 6 o'clock in London. It's 1 o'clock in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID livestream, Series 21, Episode 2, to put that in a big number, that's Episode 122, starts here. Oh, and first, it's a bit of personal news. All the very, very best to VLRM. Alas, I've had to resign from Valerium PLC today, as its deal to buy the Gibraltar Stock Exchange has fallen through. No need for an exchange expert, therefore, without a marketplace strategy, so it seemed like the best idea was to unencumber the balance sheet from my services for the time being. Good luck to everybody within VLRM, and all the very, very best to the wonderful army of shareholders that have supported Valerium through thick and thin. I really wish that you all get a wonderful result at the end of the process. Meanwhile, over at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, many are excited that CME Group has the most cash on hand for acquisitions. However, the realpolitik is that Chairman CEO Terry Duffy has noted it doesn't mean we're going to do anything. Plus ça change, despite the other monopoly milkers all hitting huge problems in recent times, as interest rates have risen and the CME USD yield curve has hit a sweet spot, the management looks likely to just hold the cash and buy back stock. Speaking of monopoly milkers who have hit trouble, the ASX, Australian Stock Exchange Group, board narrowly avoided a second strike as investors were just sufficiently lukewarm on the board's performance, while the chairman was still re-elected despite widespread criticism. Proof indeed that while Chairman Roche survives, when it comes to investors, turkeys do indeed vote for Thanksgiving and Christmas, respectively. Finally, a bit of cheering news. Well, back to the future, I suppose, at least back to the options. Miami exchanges, they are soon going to be opening a new trading floor, the first exchange floor in the city of Miami, as MIAX moves to open their Sapphire Options Exchange in 2024. Over at the London Metals Exchange, meanwhile, the most interesting news from London's Metals Week was a closer embrace of the mainland Shanghai Futures Exchange with expanded LME cooperation. And on that commodities note, we move from the hard to, well, possibly more of a soft focus. Nonetheless, our guest today is Anne Berg, and we're looking at unravelling global commodities. Anne Berg is a leading expert in commodities, commodity futures, and food security issues. She's a former grain exporter, futures trader, Chicago Board of Trade member, and director. She has worked for governmental and intergovernmental organizations, including USAID, the US State Department, the World Bank, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, the European Commission, the European Union, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a senior advisor from 2008 to 2021. Anne's participation in commodity development projects included the countries of Turkey, Egypt, India, Trinidad, Vietnam, and Ukraine. In addition, Anne has provided consulting for private commodity-based organizations, including the Turkish Derivatives Exchange Turkdex, the Pan-African Commodity Exchange PACDEX, and multinational corporations, serving as an expert witness for one. In 2012, Anne chaired the Commodity Price Formation Working Group for the Centre of European Policy Studies, a policy think tank in Brussels. Anne, welcome to the show. It's absolutely great to see you today. Where in the world are you?
I'm in Chicago. I'm about 2 miles north of the old Chicago Board of Trade building and about 100 yards from Lake Michigan. So that's where you could find me.
What a spectacular place indeed. And what's the weather like today? I suppose it's getting a little bit parky.
No, it's perfect. It's
good.
70 degrees today.
Oh, excellent. 70 degrees. My goodness. I think it's more like 7 degrees on the other scale where I am today, which is in the middle of Poland. So lucky you.
22 Celsius.
Excellent. That's absolutely marvelous. What a beautiful day altogether.
Right. Perfect late summer day.
And let me say hello to John T. John T, how good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. Good evening, Patrick, Ann et al. Great to see you, John T. If you've got a question, feel free to ask one later on. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question, ping one into the appropriate box, whether you're watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube today. And indeed, don't forget, show us a little bit of love, please. All those hearts all really help us to get up the AI algorithms and therefore get this seen by more people so that IPO-VID can be, well, more sustainable. So, Anne, tell me, how did you get into the commodity business?
Oh dear. I'll try to make it a short story. Well, first of all, both my parents were instrumental. They were both World War II soldiers. My father was in the U.S. Air Force, and he was stationed overseas in the UK. And my mother was a high-grade cipher operator or cryptographer who married my father near the end of the war. And when you have two parents like that who have, I think, been in wartime, you are brought up with a little bit of rigor and discipline. So they were very sure that they wanted their children to have high educations and so on. So that was certainly a good start in life for me. And also my father was a lawyer in the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. So I used to go down to the Grain Exchange and look at that trading floor, which I think is the most beautiful in the world. It has, as you might have described it, as cathedral-like windows and ceilings, because grain back then was sampled and put into pans, and they were then put onto these huge tables in the Grain Exchange, and they had to be viewed in natural light so that a trader could really assess the quality of the grain more than just the grade certificate that was stuck into it. So
That's fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so that really attracted me. And when I graduated, in any case, from college, the Vietnam War had ended, and there was a lot of men coming back from the war, and I had a hard time finding anything to do. So I ended up as a bookkeeper with Bunge, despite the fact that I'd had 3 courses of vector calculus, in my college years. But that was at least a start into the business. And then I honed in on Louis Dreyfus, thinking that this was a place that I wanted to work at. All of the characters were either one was from France, another was a full-blooded Onondaga Indian who had his hair down to his belt buckle. There were a few other strange characters, and I thought I would fit in. If I didn't fit in there, I wouldn't fit in anywhere. So I basically bugged them until they hired me to be a trader.
So you bugged them to hire you until you were made a trader. And how many other women traders were there at the time, if I may ask?
Well, there were 0. I mean, it was just absolutely nothing as far as I know. I mean, I became an exporter within a couple of years. And about 7 years later, I realized I never met another female in this field. It was all men. But I loved it. It was just, I'd grown up with boys. We played boy games. We had baseball and football and, all sorts of tackle games and so on. So I really felt at home in a world of men. And it just was a great challenge in any case. Exporting was just a thrilling type of occupation to have. It was full of, huge buying. The Russians would come in and buy millions of tons overnight or something, and then the Japanese would come in, and the U.S. was basically the sole supplier of grains back then. This is before you had this huge growth in South America and elsewhere. The Russians, which are now the world's biggest wheat exporter by volume, were the world's biggest wheat importer back then. And because they had depended upon this Soviet system of collectivization of farms, which, of course, resulted in the murder of millions and just the starvation of the general public. So,
yes, it's quite incredible when you think about how under the communists agriculture was a bit of a shambles, despite all of those 5-year plans and organizing the agrarian workforces and sorting out the kulaks and this and that and the other. And ultimately, the Soviet Union couldn't feed itself. Whereas after 20 years of capitalism, hey presto, they're now the biggest exporter in the world. And indeed, if Ukraine wasn't at war, they would be an even bigger mega player than they already have been.
Well, you've got Ukraine and that whole area, the Black Sea region. As I say, it went from being a net deficit to this huge exporter of grain. Ukraine in particular, you're looking at 25, 30 million tons of exports that are trying to get through today. But then you've got the European Union, who decided, first of all, to suspend the tariffs on Ukrainian grain, so that they could come overland by rail into Poland, or they could move westward. And then there was so much grain that was flooding the markets in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, and so on, that of course they put up a protest about it that resulted in a ban on. So you went from tariff-free to banning Ukrainian grain, to the EU deciding, well, somehow it's going to manage the transit of this grain through the Danube River to North Africa, which, good luck. That's all I have to say. So
it reminds me many years ago when my mother was playing tennis and I was on the Danube River near Novi Sad, and I recall telling my mother that I was on the Danube near Novi Sad, and she was playing tennis at the time with a retired member of the British Royal Navy, who promptly then proceeded to inform my mother that this was completely impossible because the Danube River didn't go anywhere near there, which perhaps demonstrates why the British Royal Navy has had a fall from grace from being number one in the world around about 1800 AD. However, it's really interesting what you're talking about here, Anne. The macro picture with grains, you're talking about a recent event, but I was brought up, and I remember in my very early formative years reading things like The Limits to Growth, that great tome, which I think inspired the Davosian defeatist narrative. But Malthus before that was quite convinced we weren't going to feed ourselves before we got to 1 billion people. We're now 7.5 billion. And it seems to me that we're still managing to feed everybody. And in fact, more and more commodities are being produced the world over from shifting different places.
Yeah, well, it is amazing. But the UN, when I worked at the UN, this is during the food crisis, of course, and I worked up until 2021 there, the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. But they would always say, are we going to run out of grain, or what? How can we talk about protecting the food security situation until 2050? And I said, well, you're asking the wrong question. I said, we can feed the world, but it's a question of what's the price of food. So, and that's what always has been the method of either bringing out more supplies or curtailing them is the price. Yeah. This is what prompted. You had I'll go back to 1973 with Nixon and the Bretton Woods collapse. Well, he took the U.S. off of the Bretton Woods agreement, so that the currency system, where all of the other countries were pegged to the United States in some way, and the U.S. was fixed to the gold, to $35 an ounce. Once that collapsed, well, prices went crazy. Then there were price controls, and we'll get to it, the soybean embargo. So because of the soybean embargo, the Japanese had just decided to start buying soybeans, said, well, we're going to start investing in Brazil. And that started, if you think about what happened in Brazil, and you can see Brazil down there in the lower left-hand corner, and a very large blue arrow emanating from there. That represents today's soybean trade into China, which certainly didn't exist back in 1973. In fact, I would say it didn't exist until China joined the WTO in 2001. So China went from 0 metric tons imports to it now imports 100 million metric tons per year out of a total trade of 150 or so. So 2/3 of all of the soybeans grown And Brazil is mostly responsible for that export growth. So the growth came out of Brazil, and that's basically started. It would have happened in any case, but it was certainly the trigger of the soybean embargo that Nixon put on back in 1973.
And it's very interesting. I mean, looking at the macro picture over time, also how Central Eastern Europe and indeed all the way into China has changed. I mean, one of the things that, well, here I am sitting in Toruń in Poland. We're in the middle of Kujawsko-Pomorskie, which is famous for producing goose. But actually what happened was during the communist era, all the geese were exported to West Germany. And effectively in return, what the people got was they got back goose fat, which was, the remnants of cooked goose fat that was left over, which was sort of a local delicacy under communism. And now they've gradually been rebuilding this goose industry so that people eat geese seasonally in this country every year. And it's incredible when you think about things like that. But it's also interesting you look at China. I mean, the whole change in Eastern Europe strikes me as incredible. You talk about the price of food. I'm just mind blown coming back here to Poland after being in the Caribbean for a couple of months, because the food here is just so plentiful and so absurdly cheap compared to what it is in either USA or indeed in USA big cities. I'm talking about places like Miami, and particularly the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, when I first got into the business, Europe was importing 20 million tons of grain from the United States. It was still shattered from World War II, and people forget these things. So, to what you're saying is absolutely true. Is that you went from a poverty situation in Europe to the formation of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was intended to not just help feed the European Union, but also to act as a kind of a wall against the Soviet incursion. That was the whole purpose, really, of the the CAP, as they call it, Common
Yes.
And it gave money, of course, to plant more and more wheat, and we heard about the mountains of grain and the lakes,
the wine lake,
right?
Yeah.
The lakes of wine and so on, until finally they decided that they were growing too much. That was back in the 1980s, I think it was. So there have been so many policy changes that I've witnessed, and of course, there's been a control of foodstuffs back to the first millennium BC, whether it was in China and in India. Grains were used as either payment of taxes, they're used for salaries. And of course, Rome had its own, bread and circuses, where it imported all of its grain from Egypt, which today is the largest importer of wheat in the entire world. So, which is pretty astonishing to me to think about.
But isn't that that is an incredibly cyclical, weird thing, that you've got these countries that can be natural bread baskets and they can completely lose the knack for whatever reason of producing what is their core produce, whether it's Egypt, Ukraine, Russia during the communist era, etc.
Right, Kazakhstan and so on. As I say, they were deficit areas, so that they've changed. But it all goes back. One thing I think is important to think about in the food markets. I should talk a little bit more about other commodities. And other commodities, like if you take the oil market, for example, you have nation states that are largely controlling the production and export of oil. Russia is a primary example of that. And in other commodities like copper, you've got these mega nationals that are mining it and producing it and shipping it and so on. This isn't true with grains. It's produced by farmers, millions of them, millions of farmers. So the governments have found, since they can't own all of the land, they tried that through collectivization. It was a complete disaster. That then they put in policies to either subsidize it or control it. The ethanol subsidy that was put in by President George Bush, and I think it was 2006, was meant really to be a price support, because the price of grain was just so low. So he thought, well, okay, we'll support it by just taking 1/3 the corn crop that's produced in the United States, and we'll divert it to cars rather. So, and of course, 2 years later, you had a food crisis. So, I guess I've looked at all of these government, I call them boondoggles, really, that they try to fix something, and basically it's like the EU with Ukrainian grain right now, and the US with the ethanol project, and China had the same problem. They were paying twice as much as the market clearing price for corn and wheat and soybeans, and it was being shipped to them just in such massive quantities that they had to finally just put a halt to it and say, okay, we're not going to pay you anymore, Chinese farmers. We're not going to pay you anymore this price for grain. We're going to cut the price in half. And that's what they did. So I don't know how you work under that system, but China is certainly feeding itself after following, of course, the Great Leap Forward, where under Mao, who ordered all of the farmers to make pig iron with their furnaces so that all of the farm implements were melted down, and 25 million people starved.
Yeah.
There's another great policy error, if you enforced error.
Well, they had 20 million people starved, and yet they managed to send lots of people for re-education, which meant they all worked in the fields, but actually productivity didn't go anywhere at the same point, which is the other pointer. And I think the third factor to that, which I always found fascinating, was that the way that the bureaucratic mindset works is that whoever you were and whatever you did previously, when you were sent for re-education, you get paid the same salary as you'd been paid previously, which was why one of the leading Chinese communist bankers was sent there, and somebody said, did you not despair? I mean, you were standing literally in a three-piece suit suddenly doing this labor. And he said, well, it was quite obvious it wasn't going to last, because they were paying me about 25 times what they were paying some of the other people to pull weeds out of the ground or whatever. So quite fascinating how these things just don't work. But I mean, looking at China, it's certainly quite incredible how China's development, just to sort of finish off on food, how China's development has absorbed so much food. Because I mean, I remember it must be getting on for 25 years ago, certainly more than 20 years ago, being on CNBC and being laughed at on the show by the presenter because I expounded upon Mark Faber's thesis, which was, if you look at food, China just has to decide to have, every family has a pint of milk a week. Every family has one steak a week. Every family has 2, 4, 6 eggs a week. And suddenly you're going to upend the global marketplace, particularly in foodstuffs that they weren't previously eating.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're the largest pork producers in the world, and the largest pork consumers. I mean, I don't know how they eat so much pork, frankly. I mean, I forget what it is per capita, but it's just this huge quantity. And then they feed it to the fish farms, to the soybeans and soybean meal. For those who aren't in grain, soybeans are crushed into products, and one is a protein meal. The other is oil, soybean oil used for cooking. So I don't know where they put the stuffs. And what did happen about, I want to say 5 or 6, maybe probably 7 years ago, is that the corn that they had, a lot of which was imported, or they just were stockpiling because they were paying so much money for it, it went bad. And it can last, grains can last for, 7-10 years. I think Joseph of Egypt, of course, hoarded grain originally for 7 years in order to store up for those lean years. But I think after about 7 years, unless you have really good storage capacity, where you're turning the grain and doing all sorts of things to keep it, it's not going to last. So they did have a situation where I think they just buried and burnt half of it.
Gosh. Well, of course, that's also the problem. I mean, famously with places like Egypt, as I seem to recall, 50% of the tomatoes on average never make it to market, which is one of the big issues. Yeah.
Right. Well, when I was in Egypt, I remember looking in Alexandria, looking at these grain silos. I'd never seen so much wheat. This place, I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, so you'd think that I would see the huge number of silos before. I never had seen such huge silos, and with grain just dripping out of them. And what they supply their people with 5 loaves of bread per day.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a wow. 5.
That is a wow.
That's part of the bread and circuses that went from Rome to Cairo and Alexandria.
Gosh. Panamet Kirkenses in five loaves. You'd certainly have to be
It's
doing
small.
well, even so, you have to be doing a lot of games in order to manage to burn those calories after all of that bread. Um, that's quite incredible. But
I think
it's very
I think they're only this big, but
okay.
all the same, it's a huge amount of
It's
bread,
incredible.
and you can
It is
imagine how much
incredible.
gets wasted.
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
might
yeah,
have
no,
changed that recently because of obviously the food crisis in 2006 and 7, and then they're just all the problems now with the Russian invasion into Ukraine and trying to get as much wheat as possible. I think it's cheaper to import from Argentina as it is to import from. If you want to import from Ukraine and have it transit through the Danube River and back down to North Africa, you're going to pay more for that than you are from Argentinian wheat.
well, I mean the thing is that's almost impossible as a transit. I mean, the Danube River is absolutely magnificent, but
Well, yeah,
it's going to take you to the middle of Austria, at which point in time you're entirely landlocked, and you're then trying to get it to North Africa, which is quite a challenge. It's incredible. I was also fascinated by what you were saying about. I mean, we often think that food security is a kind of a new buzzword that's been around. But as you say, it's been around, well, you're talking about the first century BC and before. I mean, it really has been a factor of history. Yeah, first millennia BC, sorry.
Right. So, no, it's so this is what companies do. And as I say, it's because they really can't control the farmers so much, but they can control them through price. It's not like controlling these other types of commodity industries, how much copper you produce or aluminum, which of course, we've seen in the nickel market lately, we've seen problems in. I try to keep up with all the various commodities, but it's difficult just because there's so much complexity to either the delivery markets in the futures markets, and there's all types of delivery markets and futures. Obviously, I was trading futures back in the 1980s in the pit. When there were women who had preceded me on that venture, so there wasn't a problem of being the only female standing in the pit.
It's very interesting. I mean, you talk about that. So let's come back to that in a moment, and talking about your life as a futures trader and actually how the futures business interacts with commodities as a whole. Because what I'd like to do right now, ladies and gentlemen, is we're just about halfway through the show. Is remind you, if you've got a question, to be more than welcome to ask. We'd love you to do that, and please also give us a little bit of a heart and a mention. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It helps get us up the rankings. We're here unraveling global commodities with Anne Berg, and Woman on It says, greetings, such a wonderful guest. And thank you very much as well to Mary. Anne's work in food security is truly admirable. Hashtag woman power. Absolutely. Hack the future. Presumably grain bushel by bushel, I suppose, in the case of hacking the future. In that case, let's talk about another formidable woman for a moment. Actually, this week's book of the week, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, that we have a finance book of the week series running, Trading in Sync with Commodities, is by another formidable lady who cut her teeth in the Chicago markets, Susan Abbott-Giddle. Susan Abbott-Giddle was indeed our guest on IPO-VID 115. She is the publisher of the Red Letter Trading Days astrological trading newsletter, and her book, surprisingly enough, is Trading in Sync with Commodities, introducing astrology to your technical toolbox. Written for those who might be unfamiliar with either commodities or astrology, Susan includes 101 chapters on each topic, as well as an astrological glossary. In addition, she covers how astrology can help you discover which markets you might be most attuned for trading. What a really, really fascinating book. If you've got a suggestion for book of the week, do ping it over to us, ladies and gentlemen. And let me also add that, of course, if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in the world of commodities markets from an exchange perspective, or the world of exchanges as a whole, then check out our newsletter, Exchange Invest, via exchangeinvest.com. There's a charge for the exchange of information itself, the Monday to Friday edition. But if you like a bit of a longer macro read and some stimulus, the Saturday edition is totally free. You can sign up for that as well at exchangeinvest.com. commodities.com, and that will arrive in your inbox, strangely enough, every Saturday. The alternative is, if you're interested only in the wonderful world of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and the brave new world of digital assets, we also have BitCarnage, which is on Substack, to which you can subscribe as well via that means. Now, back to our fantastic guest this evening. We're talking about unraveling global commodities, and I've got to say we've been looking at a very, very interesting picture of the world of grains, foodstuffs, food securities, and more. And you started talking about the futures markets, and I think one of the core things that's widely misunderstood is people always see the concept of a futures market as something that actually works to the detriment of the populace when it comes to pricing commodities.
Oh no, when I joined with PACDEX, the Pan-African Derivatives Exchange, I said, if you can get a futures market going here for like cocoa farmers, and in this case, it was to look at the cotton market in Egypt. I said, you're going to increase the price transmission to farmers by twofold. Their incomes can go up by that much just because you've got transparency. You cut out several middlemen or women in the long supply chains and so on. And you saw that in India. When India banned its futures markets from World War II onwards until 2006, they used to have a vibrant market in rubber and tea, sugar, and it was traded against the London futures markets at that time. This is pre-World War II. And that all got shut down in the name of the war because, the commodities became expensive, so therefore the futures market were shut down and did not revive until 2006 as part of this whole commodity futures revival that happened, after year 2000. I think China kind of spurred things on there. So that market in something like cardamom and in mint, the farmers were getting twice the price as what they were getting before.
Wow.
And because, for one thing, like in cardamom, it became the exporter's choice to actually take delivery of cardamom in the approved warehouse. So they knew they had the quality. It became, a premium item instead of being a secondary item into the export market. So as I say, it had a halo effect around the entire producer economy and all of the secondary and tertiary operations, and around the commodities. Same with mentha oil. Mentha oil is the stuff that you find in toothpaste and soaps and shampoos and so on. It's ubiquitous. It's just you're going to find it everywhere. And that was another one that helped the farmers tremendously to sell into the futures market because they could actually deliver on it.
It's fascinating. And I mean, as I recall, the original multi-commodity exchange of India, they had something going with, I can't remember if it was UN-FAO or it was with the World Bank or whatever, or one of the development. But I mean, as I seem to recall, they had this habit of chalking. They used to fax the prices to the rural post offices. And when you walked into the rural post office, they chalked the prices on a blackboard. And then people could see what the price was. So if you were a farmer and you were going to grow something, you would walk in the door and you'd say, oh, wow, the price of cardamom was really good. And they knew that they could grow cardamom, whatever their land was. And they could actually, I think there was even a program at one stage where you could actually go to the World Bank and you could instantly walk in the door, to their office, and they would actually give you the seeds and sell the future against it. So you automatically knew what you had, which was you went from a subsistence farmer who had no idea what you might get from your produce to effectively a hedged farmer. You knew what you were going to get at the end of the day. And now you were a businessman or a businesswoman. You were hedging, you were hedged. You knew what your output price was, and therefore you knew what your profit margin was. And I mean, such a motivating factor for farmers in rural areas, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. This transformed there in India. There's something like, at least there were 10,000 farmer suicides, producer suicides in a year. Just an alarming, horrible number. And it's because they couldn't come up with the money. So you had a financing section of this. And then also farmers tend to sell in the harvest gut slot, they call it. And that's going to be the cheapest price of the year. So they can't store their grain. And now that once you have futures, excuse me, there's all sorts of deferreds that you can sell. And then you could say, well, I've locked in my price for the December futures instead of the August futures or whatever it is, the July futures. So you could get a loan on that. It enables a whole economy to do well. I think that's what's been lost is this on the markets is there can be too much speculation. I used to get almost into arguments with various hedge fund managers and so on. They said, oh, well, it's all fundamentals. We don't have any impact on price. I said, you're telling me that when you buy and sell futures that you're not partaking in price discovery then, that you aren't part of the markets, because all it is just buyers and sellers. When you have more buyers and sellers, markets prices are going to go up. So yes, they come back to, obviously they are going to revert to the mean, or they're going to revert to, a normalized price. But speculation remains a problem. And this is why I really loved what your previous guest, Andrea Corcoran, said about some of these invented markets, she called them, which have to do with digital assets, because there's so little, as I see, that are fundamentals behind them that I can't tell what's driving the price. I really can't.
Yeah.
Other than just buyers rushing in and herd mentality of some sort.
Well, we go back to where we were about 2 years ago, where lots of people were telling me, no, you just don't understand. Bitcoin is digital gold. And I was saying, well, okay, so if I have a piece of gold, I can go and make, a piece of jewelry. It is useful in certain engineering applications. It has a huge market for it in beauty, et cetera, et cetera. Can you take me a Bitcoin, which is a pixel, and turn that into a necklace? And of course, the answer is you can't, because it's absolutely nothing. So yes, I love that concept of invented markets, which Andrea christened, that you mentioned. It was really, really cool altogether. And obviously, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a few great commodities guests recently. We had Rod Gravel of London last week, who was talking about being on the road with his commodity markets in South Africa, which was an absolutely fascinating show. Fascinating show. And you worked with Rod, yeah.
On a couple of projects, one in Trinidad, where we're looking at the prospect of using their LNG market and turning that into a futures market. But unfortunately, they only had one terminal that was pricing the LNG. So you can't have a monopoly supplier being the sole source of pricing for a futures market, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And they have since then, because of course there was the downturn and this is before the Russian invasion, of course, the LNG plant got mothballed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quite incredible, whereas LNG is quite the thing these days. I mean, it's absolutely, and you look at, I mean, it's also interesting, actually, you talk about LNG, look at how the European Union tried to step forth into the waves like King Canute last year and control the price of LNG, which was just hilarious.
No, I know. I think that, well, they put also a price cap on the oil, and Russia got around that and still getting around it by simply inflating the price of freight for shipping Russian oil to another country. And this bypasses the cap. Every time I see these things, I just shake my head. I wonder why they even try. But
yes, the bureaucrats really don't stand a chance when you've got the ingenuity of the human mind. I mean, another great criminal scam that springs to mind was in Romania a few years ago, where they thought, what a great idea, we'll put barcode stickers on all of the meat. So what happened was all the good quality beef coming out of the Romanian abattoirs was packaged up, and people would bribe and effectively they would pay for the meat, they'd take the meat away, they would sell the beef locally at a discounted price. But then what they ended up with was they kept the barcode, and they then would apply the barcode to a bunch of horse meat and export that as beef, and got away with it for a year or two before anybody caught on to what was happening, which is another great example of how the thought of digitizing supply chains can have its pitfalls, as we've seen with people walking around, what was it, nickel warehouses just recently, trying to kick the bags of metal to see if any were stones. Now, look, before we get on to that, actually, I just want to get to, we've got a few great comments here as we go along. You have an invitation, Anne, in fact, Woman on It. Anne was a special guest during our Woman on It March gathering. I do believe that was at the Casino Maltese in Valletta at one point in time. Her stories were so captivating. Anne, hope to host you on our Positivity Hack Delivered. I look forward to that. I think you will be a great guest on Positivity Hack Delivered, Anne, altogether. Now, we then move on to a fascinating question. And John T. has been asking a question. Thank you very much, John. It's great to hear from you again. With everybody talking about AI, does or will artificial intelligence have an impact on the commodities market and the movement of commodities around the world?
Oh, dear.
There's a question.
Yeah, there's a question. I'm going to have to prove a little bit of ignorance on that one because AI is so new and I just don't know enough about it. But that said, the way commodities are priced is, think of the world as a giant price matrix. So the highest prices in the world, of course, are the deficit areas such as China, because China doesn't have enough arable land to feed itself, so it has to import, period. And the lowest prices are, for example, such as North Dakota, which is buried in the Midwest of the United States and has a very high freight rate to get its soybeans or dark northern spring wheat to market. So if you think of the world as commodities as a matrix like that, a price matrix of moving from deficit to high priced areas, I could do that pretty much in my head when I was. In fact, I had some mathematical skills when I was younger. I don't know if I still do anymore, but that was one of the reasons why I was able to stay on as a grain exporter, because I could do the calculations very fast when we had export tenders and we had to get a quote out to Egypt or Mexico or someplace that wanted to buy grain from Louis Dreyfus, or wanted to buy it from when I worked for Philip Brothers as well. So there are only a few variables, really. There's the freight, there's the cost at the origin. There's the freight to maybe an export point, and then there's the ocean freight then to the other point of consumption. Interest money now has come back into play with rates going up. And then there's war risk insurance, you might call it. So if you think that the cargo's got a chance of being mined and blown up, obviously that's going to be another factor that we didn't really have to deal with, at least I didn't deal with very much in my export years. So I'm sure it will help to have artificial intelligence, but as I'm trying to describe, the variables are not very complex, really. It's, as I say, it's just time, freight, and price of origin, really, and you just pack on everything else. So I hope that.
I think that's a great point, and I think the one area where I can see AI could have a future is in two areas. One is in pure play logistics, as we end up with presumably more autonomous vehicles, and quite feasibly, I suspect where we're going to end up with a lot of autonomous vehicles is going to be in actually very unpopulated areas. I mean, the idea at the moment where everybody wants to have a taxi without a driver in the middle of San Francisco strikes me as somewhat optimistic. But the possibility to be able to transport to and from, say, the very most remote areas of the Midwest of America through the night, etc., when there's essentially no traffic around, I think could alter a lot of logistics. And the possibility of AI controlled, effectively human-free cargo ships, etc., or at least much less staffed cargo ships, is a very interesting prospect.
Well, you should have answered the question.
Well, the other one I'll guess at. Yeah,
no. I've got one more point to make. Is that AI is being used. This is, I think, about almost 9 years ago. I wrote a comparative study of agriculture in 6 countries, which included Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Ukraine, United States, and I can't remember the other one. In any case, Argentina was on the very forefront of using GPS to plant its crop and determine, exactly how much fertilizer should be put in, and determine all sorts of things that you couldn't have done without artificial intelligence and GPS technology. So I think in the planting, it's being used. It probably has a lot more usefulness than in the actual moving of crops around, really.
Yes.
But there's no question. Maybe if you had an exporter on here right now, he would probably say, I was full of it. So you should probably go to somebody who's got a recent track record of working in the export markets.
But you make a great point. I mean, the whole concept of GPS geomapping, where they actually map your entire field, and the tractor basically can drive autonomously all the way around your field, and they're now using autonomous drones as well to drop fertilizer and so on, which means that it's fully targeted, that it lands exactly on the seed, and they use much less of it, etc. Those are all fabulous ways that they're increasing crop yield at a lower cost. So that's a very, very good point, I think, for AI. So I hope that helps answer your question, John T. Thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. So, I mean, Anne, looking at one thing, we've sort of touched upon it over time. You've mentioned in passing some of these things. The one thing I can't help but notice is that for all of this AI, technology, digitization, everything that becomes more and more sophisticated, boy, the commodity markets are still incredible for their ability to have scams.
Yeah. Well, it's really something. I think I mentioned to you that when I first got into the business, this was at a major grain firm, I was told about, I wasn't really taught it, but I was told about what was called the bucket trick. And this involved having a 50-gallon drum of beautiful number one bright malting Larker barley. The drum was filled with it. It sparkled in the light. And as the rail cars were probed out in North Dakota that were to come into Minneapolis for inspection and order, the samples were sent, and they were brought in by just a bag, and they were supposed to be put into pans. Well, under the bucket trick, you threw those samples out, and then you dipped your pan into this 50-gallon drum of bright malting Larker barley, and you wrote up a new grade for this particular car. That was a complete scam. And then that was put onto the floor of the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, where a trader would come by and look at it and go, oh my goodness, this looks beautiful, and buy it. And the price was at least 50% above what the price was being paid for to the farmer, who shipped in this moldy, broken kernels, ergoty or whatever. I mean, it just number 4 or 5. It wasn't even capable of malting. So, I mean, this is the sort of stuff, bait and switch, that goes on all the time. I didn't expect to see it in the, and by the way, he went to jail, the fellow who taught me. I never succumbed to any of this sort of what I call tomfoolery or whatever, because I never wanted to go to jail. And I saw it also at the Board of Trade, some sorts of baiting and switching, and it didn't interest me to spend the rest of my life behind bars for something so ridiculous.
I'm with you. I mean, I have to say, of all the colors I can possibly wear, orange, and particularly in a jumpsuit, is not the most flattering. So I have no intention of putting one on.
Horizontal stripes myself.
No. There you go. Definitely, they just don't work. They just don't work at all. But it is incredible how, I mean, I suppose the limits of human ingenuity are quite boundless, because no matter what technology you put together, someone always tries to find another way to work their way around a scam about it.
Well, how could somebody put rocks into nickel bags? I don't understand it. I mean, who's guarding the hen house there? I mean, these things come in, and you're supposed to sample them. You're supposed to look at them. You're supposed to do something. Obviously, there's some either collusion on the part of some of the people that are working there, or else just a complete incompetence. Yeah. So there's the coffee bags that were stolen. I was called once from London. They wanted me to look in. This is years and years ago, but it was about 30 years ago. So they wanted me to look into some sort of grain accounting scam in Africa, I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, we've just lost all of this tonnage somehow. And they said, don't you know grain accounting? I said, yeah, I do. And I'm not interested in this particular project, because you can imagine whoever the thief was would have a target on me as soon as I went down to investigate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, there's so many ways. Tino DeAngelis floated oil above water in his tanks.
That's genius.
Yeah,
that was genius. The salad oil scandal, wasn't it?
Salad oil scandal, right? They're still around. So, and I don't expect that sort of thing. Well, you've got Russia right now scamming the European Union with its fake invoices.
Yeah.
Putting inflated freight rates and so on to prove that it's complying with the cap. So, and there's, I think, quite a bit of, well, I don't know what to call it, but when you have a war and when you have all of this dislocation of commodity such as you have, and you've got sanctions, and there's ways of getting around it, and what these firms, some of the major oil firms, not the producers, but the trading firms, have made just record amounts of money, huge record amounts of money. And it's because they just pad their prices with margins, huge margins.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, you talked about GPS earlier. I mean, one of the great scams I can remember from early in my trading career was the ability of tanker companies to suddenly not know where their tankers were, and at the point in time when a particular market in, say, oil was at a low or a high, they could manage to turn up appropriately with a tanker just in the nick of time, and nobody realized it was out there. And of course, nowadays you can track everything on GPS, which is why you've got some of these tankers suddenly going dark when they're in the middle of nowhere. And you see that in the arbitrage markets off on the banks off of Malta, where there's quite a brisk trade to be done, because that's where the Libyan oil washes up. I mean, quite literally in big tankers, and they offload it and then they take it to Sicily or whatever. So it does lend itself. It reminds me of a beautiful story, actually, which was a friend who was introduced me in Serbia to a chap who was truly larger than life, and I want to write a book about him someday, because it was just so hilarious, all of his great scams. And the excuse given was that he was arrested in the Danube. He was arrested on the beach on the Danube during the time that Serbia was under oil sanctions during the post-Yugoslav wars. And my friend drolly commented that, yes, they found him with 100 containers, 100 drums of oil he'd offloaded onto a beach somewhere in Serbia. And I said, oh no, was it criminal? And he said, it was a little lexicographical problem. And I said, lexicographical problem? And he said, yes, he thought FOB stood for free on the beach. So there you go. There's a very nerdy commodity joke for you, folks. Sorry. Good grief. That's even worse than a dad joke, that you managed to get these things in. Now, look, Anne, we've had this spectacular unraveling of global commodities. I think we could do it all again next week and have another hour of unraveling even more commodities. But what I'd like to talk to you about is just the future. I mean, where do you, Anne Berg, think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, I'm not going to talk about capital markets, are way beyond me. I'm talking about the financial markets, the stock markets, the equity, the bonds, and so on. So if I can just limit my remarks to the commodities markets, which I think I know something about, is that I think we saw our peak performance and growth since China joined the WTO in 2000. Then that's when you had for the last 20 years, you've had this growth in commodity futures markets everywhere, because I think finally governments realize that this is a way that they can actually help either in the allocation of commodities or in price realization by producers and so on. But when you have, and what we've seen increasingly is currency devaluations. I mean, crazy currency devaluations. I don't know where the Argentine peso today is, but I read last week it was somewhere around 970 to the dollar. And I think I mentioned to Patrick that it would cost you 2 million pesos, Argentine pesos, to buy an ounce of gold. That's a currency system that you can't live with. So when you have more risk in your currency system in some areas than you have in the commodity, the actual price of commodity, you're not going to have a futures market on it. Nobody's going to use it. And I think otherwise you've got sanctions, war sanctions, protectionism, naturally, probably hoarding. I'm sure China is still, trying to stockpile and so on. And understandably, I mean, countries have to protect their own food security. So protection of food security starts to override any kind of, price discovery and free trade and so on. And we've seen things go up and down before. It's certainly, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, trade collapsed by 60%. So I'm not trying to forecast anything like that, but I'm saying that once you have instability and it shows up in currency markets particularly, that I think we're taking a pause here, certainly on the high growth cycle that we saw.
Anne, you have unraveled the global commodity markets with an absolute masterclass. Thank you very much. I think it's incredible to think
of. Still going to see trading. You're still going to see trading, and but you may not be using the markets for a hedge. It's the price of oil is one thing in one area, and then you go to the other area, and it's completely different. So, what futures market do you use, or you don't use any? You just pad your margins.
Yes. I think that's a very apt point on which to end. Whatever happens, there will be speculation on where commodity prices are going to be in the future, and there probably won't be one single commodity price for anything anywhere in the world. But nonetheless, that's what the whole debate is about. Anne Berg, this has been absolutely marvelous. You've been unraveling global commodity prices. It's been absolutely superb. Unraveling Global Commodities with Anne Berg has been our show this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Next week, we're going to have an absolutely magnificent guest. We're moving on to another of Chicago's finest, the father of financial futures, Professor Dr. Richard Sander. He's going to be with us on the 31st of October at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Central European Time, rather, 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Same as usual. Really looking forward to that show, building up to a big crescendo of Chicago superstars that we've had during the course of this season of IPO-VID. It remains for me to say thank you very, very much to our contributors this evening. John T., thank you for your question. Woman on it. Yes, I'm looking forward to Anne on your show as well, PhD. Mary, thank you for your question. Thanks to our fantastic production team today. Janella, Mary, and Marianne, you did an absolutely marvelous, seamless, and perfect job. And most of all, I want to say huge thanks to my dear friend, Anne Berg, for coming along and giving us the Commodities Masterclass that I was so excited to wait for. And it's been absolutely brilliant. And I hope you'll join us again on the show some other time, and we can talk about other commodity issues as they're burning brightly across the firmament. My name is Patrick L. Young. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm off to, well, apart from anything else, find myself a new job after Valerian PLC and get into the process of editing tomorrow's Exchange Invest. Don't forget, you can sign up for that at exchangeinvest.com. I wish you all a great week in life and markets. Thanks for watching.